Good morning. Good morning. I'm Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, welcome. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I'm going to address the vision of recovery and the promise of the 12th step, which is a spiritual awakening. A change in the way we feel, a change in the way we think, most especially a change in the way we behave. And the balance of the Appendix 2 in the big book that's talking about a spiritual experience and a spiritual awakening then nails it. This is not a self-help program. This is a program for the helpless and the hopeless and the desperate and the powerless. It's a change in the way we think and feel and behave, and it's done to us, not by us. Now, those of you who are in 12-step and have in fact done any of the step work, you know that you do a lot of work. It's not just a gimme, gimme, gimme. It's like you show up and you do a lot of work. But my experience is that the results are disproportionate to the work that I put into it. Positively disproportionate to the work that I put into it. All of this work has an intention that is articulated in the big book to allow us to be happy, joyous, and free. And to the extent that there is anyone in our life, including ourselves, that is, could we shut the door, please? That is unforgiven, we are in bondage of those unforgiving feelings, that darkness that shades us from the sunlight of the Spirit. Today we're going to explore, this is kind of a roadmap, what does forgiveness mean? A lot of misunderstanding about what forgiveness is. How does a person forgive? A lot of misunderstanding about what the process is. And how does it fit into the 12-step process? I knew nothing about the 12-step process, and I knew nothing about forgiveness, despite the fact I had studied 7 years to be a Catholic priest. 7 years in a monastery. 7 years of silence. Yeah. 17 to 24. Whoa. Wouldn't you think I'd come out knowing some spiritual stuff? Yeah, well, I didn't. It took being in the 12-step program for 4 years and then finding a man who understood the big book and the 12-step process to show me the path. And my concept of sponsorship, my concept of a step guide, and if you get nothing else but this, right at the beginning when you're fresh, all right? This man, a sponsor or a step guide, was a person who stood by the path that he had walked. And he shone the light of his experience on the path that he had walked, so that I could walk that path in the light of his experience, but then have my own experience. My sponsor and step guide are not the light. They're the lantern. Today I hope to be the lantern that sheds some light of my experience on the path that I have walked, that allows me to live in a state of happy, joyous, and free. There is nobody in my life, past, present. There is no event in my life, past or present, that hasn't been addressed through the process. And there is forgiveness. So, you've come here today with a lot of information and a lot of experience. And Einstein said the consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. I haven't read Einstein, but I read his quotes because they're brilliant. The consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. We need a new consciousness. We need to wake up, and that's the promise of the 12 steps, having had a spiritual awakening. That's the promise, the guarantee, the warranty of doing the first 11 steps. Our mind, when it's delusional, manifests delusional results. And we don't know that we don't know. And we can't see that we don't see because we're looking through the lens of delusion, and we can't see the lens because it's that which we are looking through. We can't see that we don't see. At age 48, 1988, I was startled when I went through the step process, especially the resentment inventory. And I saw that I was responsible. Oh, not for my past and not for my events in some cases, but I was responsible for my feelings about it. And I didn't know that I didn't know, and I began to know that I didn't know, and that's a spiritual awakening. You've come here with knowledge and you've come here with experience, and to the extent that you hold on to that knowledge and that experience, guaranteed you won't walk out of here with any new knowledge or experience. Are you willing to at least set it aside? I'm not saying let it go. I'm not saying change it. I'm just saying, are you willing to say to the spirit of the universe or to your higher self that I'm willing to have an open heart and an open mind and to set aside what I know and to set aside what my experiences are, to set aside my prejudices and to set aside my beliefs for a couple hours so that I can hear and perhaps acquire some new information and a new experience and be taken to a place that you don't even know exists. Totally my experience. I was taken to a place that I did not know exists, and it continued because I stayed gently pressed up against this process. This is my mental image. I'll use a lot of mental images. It helps me articulate it, and perhaps it helps you understand it and experience it. I stay gently pressed up against this process, this step work, this way of life that we have. And as I do that, the Spirit invites me forward, and I absorb it, and it absorbs me. So I invite you to a set-aside prayer. Now, there's no set-aside prayer in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the other literature. But it is referred to when Carl Jung and Roland Hazard are chatting. Carl Jung is saying to Roland Hazard, the first guy who was given the answer to the problem, what is the solution to my alcohol problem? Carl Jung said, a spiritual experience. And he said, these are page 27 in the big book, if you want to make a note. These are vital spiritual experiences, phenomena that are huge emotional displacements and rearrangements, ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. It is an emotional rearrangement. And there are several other references like that in the big book, suggesting that we let go of our old ideas, but I'll just read one more prominent one, and that is in chapter 5, how it works just before it articulates the third step and the process for the balance of the steps. On page 58, Bill says, with all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the results were nil until we let go absolutely. Can you let go absolutely? Absolutely not. But can you pray to the Spirit or to your higher self to release you from the information and from your experience so that you'll be taken to a place that you don't even know exists? Absolutely. Willing to be taken. The key, Bill suggests in chapter 4, when he's preparing us for step 2, that willingness is the cornerstone of the spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. Just the willingness. As you know, in the rooms of the 12-step spirituality, it's part of our wisdom. It doesn't matter what you know, and it doesn't matter what you think, and it doesn't matter how you feel, and it doesn't matter what you want. It does matter what you do. And when you do differently, you will think differently and you will feel differently. Acts contrary to our will. So please join me in that set-aside prayer. It's on the prayer page. It's the second prayer on the prayer page. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. So forgiveness is a process. It's not an event. You probably won't walk out of here having forgiven everybody in your past. Although it is possible. And I'm going to show you how that's possible, that you could walk out of here today in a state of forgiveness. Yeah. It's an organic process. A process like a dimmer switch, not like a light switch. That's the difference between a spiritual awakening and a spiritual experience. A spiritual experience is what Bill had. Page 14, mountaintop experience. Boom! The room filled with light. It seemed that the room was filled with the presence of God, and he was overwhelmed with that sense. He was lifted to the top of a mountain, and a clear wind blew through him. It lasted 20 minutes, and at the conclusion of that experience, 20 minutes, he was in his second day of detox, by the way. Yeah, his second day of detox, December 12th, December 13th, something like that. And he knew at the end of that 20-minute experience that his alcohol problem had been removed, and that his life's work, his life's destiny was to work with others to help them get that message, that their alcohol problem can be dealt with. Very powerful experience. But then in Appendix 2, he distinguishes that with what the majority of us will have, which is a spiritual awakening. A slow, gradual, educational variety, William James calls it. And I liken it to a spiritual experience being a light switch, boom, on or off, and a spiritual awakening being a dimmer switch, gradually going up a notch at a time. So imperceptible, bringing new light, imperceptible, day in, day out, one notch at a time, that we don't recognize it's happening. Until there comes a moment where the light has accumulated sufficient power that we begin to see. Maybe that we didn't see. We begin to know maybe that we didn't know. And that's a spiritual awakening. My experience with this process and with this program is the dimmer switch. A slow process of enlightenment. I believe that's what's meant by that, more light. Now, of course, as the lights get brighter, the good news is you see more. Yeah. And as the lights get brighter, the bad news is that you see more. That's right. So here's the reality. You have been hurt. You have been betrayed. You have been disappointed. You have been abused. You have been misled. You have been lied to and you have been frustrated by events and by people. The first step in the process is to name that. To name it. I'm suggesting today, as painful as it might be, is that you remember. You dig back in your memory, or maybe you don't have to dig too hard. And you visualize the perpetrator. And you make a note on that little piece of paper with the pen that you have. And if you don't have one, there's some back there. Because it's really important. The first step in the process is to acknowledge, I have been hurt, I have been betrayed, and this is the name of the person, and this is the event. What happened? It might be that you have unforgiveness toward yourself for unhealthy decisions, poor choices in your actions, or poor choices in your inaction. Sigmund Freud said, the work of the human being is to make the unconscious conscious. This is what we do in step 12 work. From step 1, powerless, to step 12, spiritual awakening, the work is the penetration of the unconscious. That's not in the big book, but that is absolutely my description of my experience and understanding of the process. Continuing with Freud, he said, the work of the human is to penetrate the unconscious and make it conscious. Because if we don't, we conclude that our life and its consequences is a result of faith or other people's fault. Totally relevant to what we're looking for here is to become more conscious. Step 11 in the big book says that its purpose is to improve our conscious contact. I will even broaden it. It's to improve our consciousness. With more consciousness, we can see more. The higher up on the mountain that you go, the better perspective that you have, the more information, the clearer your vision, the more perspective on reality that you have, the better decisions that you can make and the better actions that you can take based on those decisions. It's all not guaranteed. We all know that we can know better but not do better. There's a nice correlation between knowledge and action. Without the knowledge, I don't have the alternative. With the knowledge, I at least have the alternatives, and I have a choice. The two things that make us specifically human are that we can know and know that we know. We can transcend ourselves and reflect on ourselves. No other sentient being can do that. But that's not enough. The other half of what makes us human is that we can take action. We can make a choice, a free choice, to take action or not to take action. The man who took me through the steps in 1988 said, willingness without action is fantasy. He was a real hard ass. Yeah. When I would tell him that I was willing, I just hadn't done the work, he said, willingness without action is fantasy. So I got too busy, yeah. In psychology, one of the wisdom sayings is, you need to name it in order to tame it. I'm a word guy. That appeals to me because it's so short and it's so profound. Name it to tame it. We need to know, then we have the alternative. Without knowing, you don't have the alternative. Think about today. You knew about this and you made a choice to come. Other people knew about it and they made a choice not to come. But if you didn't know about it, you couldn't make the choice. That's why it's important to name the people and the events that are unforgiven in your life. Just one. We're not going to do a full inventory today, but just one today, and you will sample and you will taste, and you might plant a seed that will sprout. All of the even steps, and check it out on your own, the dynamic. All of the even steps are about naming. Naming God in 2, naming obstacles in 4, naming defects in 6, naming harms in 8, and continuing to name them in 10. It's really an interesting dynamic. And all the odd steps are about making a decision and taking some action. Yeah. Bill recognized this dynamic, whether consciously or unconsciously, of what makes us specifically human. So forgiveness is not, oh my goodness, look at that list. Now you may have had a preconception about what forgiveness was, and maybe it was one of those words. I'm not going to read them. Forgiveness is not that. In fact, the last one there, surrender justice, brings to mind a very powerful example. I was working with a guy who was in the program for a while, taking him through the steps, and he got to this area of amends. And his father, the grandfather of his 2 daughters, unbeknownst to him, had molested his 2 daughters, 8 and 12. When he discovered it, obviously he went through an awful lot of difficulty, and he engaged some professional help through therapy, which is totally recommended to support the process of the spiritual 12 steps, of course. And then he was brought to a place of making an amends for anything that he had done and forgiving his father. But he also reported it to the police, who then convicted him through the court system, and at age 68, he went to prison for 6 years. He forgave his father, but he wasn't going to model for his daughters that it was all right. It was wrong, dead wrong, criminally wrong, and Grandpa's going to prison. All right? Now, he's got boundaries around his visitation with the family and his relationship, but he lives in peace. He lives free. He is not angry. He is living in forgiveness because he released it. Look it up in the dictionary. So simple. Look at my hand. Forgiveness, to release. A decision to release. It's amazing. It is not to retaliate or exact revenge or seek compensation or judge. Although that's what we do as human beings, and that's our first reaction. It's really a decision to release them, to release ourselves, and in the process be released. Well, we have a couple prayers in the fellowships that acknowledge that. If you pay attention to the words, the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, says, forgive us as we forgive them. Oh, that puts a burden right there. Damn. And St. Francis, a prayer that is alleged to his writing, he didn't write it, of course, but the spiritual principles there were his. And he says, forgive in order to be forgiven. He's got actually 2 references, and we'll pray that as our concluding prayer today. It's a process, not an event. It's a decision. This is the key. If you can get this one before you walk out today, because I'm going to repeat it over and over and over again, it's a decision first. My experience also is that underneath every step, not just the first step, of course, underneath the first step is powerless. Well, what does powerless mean? We get brain dead to the words we hear regularly in the rooms. Challenge yourself not to be brain dead, not to be heart dead. What does it mean, powerless? Try this. No choice. I have no choice once I take a drink. My biology takes over. Dr. Silkworth called it an allergy that produces a phenomenon of craving. Once I make a decision not to drink, and I don't have any type of spiritual program to support that, my mind takes over, and I live in the obsession and the delusion, and I take a drink not remembering the consequences, not remembering the resolutions. Seriously. With all the education and all the introspection that you might suspect I had in 7 years of silence in a monastery, I'm still a retard when it comes to alcohol. All right, I hope that doesn't offend anybody, but when I look at 20 years of drinking where I had blackouts and jails and car wrecks and problems, and I didn't see them as related to alcohol, whew, that's the obsession. That's the delusion. And I'm powerless. I had no choice. See, I'm not responsible for my powerlessness. I am responsible to address it. It's not a subtle difference. There are 6 steps to the process of recovery. First, we have to name it, which is in fact what I've asked you to do, to acknowledge it. And next, we have to understand it, which we will be taking a look at as a process. This is kind of another roadmap for you. I'm a big believer in context. If you kind of have a sense where you're going, you can kind of track it and kind of follow it, but follow it with your heart also. My experience is that I came out of the seminary, look up again, please. I came out of the seminary with a lot of information. I came into AA and got some more information. I was 4 years sober, going to a meeting twice a day, and I had a sponsor, and I had worked the steps on my own with no help, thank you, because, you know, I'm pretty knowledgeable, and I read English, and the book is in English, therefore I don't need your help, thank you very much. Well, in 1988, 4 years sober, I'm restless, irritable, and discontent, and I talk about a man who talks credibly about being happy, joyous, and free as the result of working the steps out of the big book precisely as a textbook. That was new language. That was a new experience. And I knew from the tone in his voice and the look in his eyes and the content of his words that he had something different than I had. And he said, Herb, I interviewed him for about an hour after the meeting, and he did this to me. Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have no transformation. Wow. I heard it. I heard it. Because he said, you haven't brought your information to your experience. You haven't brought your head to your heart. It hasn't happened to you. You've tried to make it happen by yourself. And I was willing to begin to pray the set aside and to take directions from this man, not knowing what he had and not knowing what to expect, but kind of witnessing that he had something that I wanted. The next piece is to acknowledge the reality, my attitude about reality, and then to take responsibility and be in acceptance for the decisions and the actions that I've taken. And finally, to implement those decisions. Step 3 is really clear. It's a decision. Step 2 is not so clear, but it's a decision also, a decision about God. Whereas step 3 is a decision for God, to have a relationship. But the big book is very clear. Right after we take the 3rd step, it says nothing's going to happen on a permanent basis unless you do the following, steps 4 through 9. A decision without action. Again, fantasy. I mentioned to you that I want to put the forgiveness process in the context of the 12 steps. I was asked in 10 or so years ago to be on a psychologist. And he's a PhD from Stanford. And he had done research, reliable research on forgiveness. And he had written a book. If you have any interest in reading from a non-spiritual, non-psychological, non-12-step process, read Forgive for Good by Fred. Forgive for Good, Fred Luskin. I read it a second time in preparation for our work here today. It's a fabulous, very accessible book, and it has all of the principles and the process of forgiveness from a psychological standpoint. And I read his book in preparation for the panel several years ago. And after I had presented the forgiveness process from the 12-step viewpoint, and he had from the psychological viewpoint, we were having a little conversation about it. And I said to him, wow, Fred, your book is great. The process was great. I had a great time on the panel. It seems that the process is the same, psychological and 12-step. The process and the dynamics are the same. The vocabulary is a little different, but the process is the same. And he said, he just looked at me. He didn't miss a beat. He says, but you 12-steppers have an advantage. I said, what's that? He said, you got God. How cool is that? He said, I can't use that as part of a psychological research or explanation, but it's clearly an advantage when you bring that concept into the mix. I thought that was wonderfully humble of him to actually acknowledge that. So, putting it in the 12-step context, we have seen that we're powerless in step one. That is, we have no choice. I've just referenced Dr. Silkworth, who said that we have an allergy. That's the history behind it. And then, of course, Roland Hazard was able to find the Oxford group founded by Frank Buchman, who had a process, a 6-step process, the predecessor to the Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill joined the Oxford group and got sober. He worked those 6 steps. He reached out to Bob, who was already in the Oxford group 2.5 years. Bob is a scientist and a Christian, and he goes to a meeting once a week of the Oxford group, and they pray, and they read scripture, and they meditate, and then they share. And every week after the Oxford group meeting, he went home and got drunk. He was living in the solution, but he didn't know what the problem was. Bill comes with no sophistication in religion, certainly, and not a Christian, certainly, at that time. And he shares with Bob the disease concept that Silkworth had shared with him and that he had experienced, that he is indeed powerless in his body and he's powerless in his mind. It's not about knowledge and it's not about willpower. Carl Jung said you need to find a spiritual experience, and Bill calls him the spiritual father of Alcoholics Anonymous. Jung wrote a letter to Bill in 1961, actually 4 months before Carl Jung died. And I'll paraphrase it. He said, Bill, you're doing great work, and the institution of Alcoholics Anonymous is worldwide, and it's saving a lot of lives. He says, my observation is alcoholics are uniquely spiritual people. Uniquely spiritual. They are thirsting for the Spirit with a capital S, and they get distracted with spirits with a small s. That cool? Yeah. At the bottom, he has a Latin phrase, spiritus contra spiritum. The Spirit with a capital S is the antidote to spirits with a small s. The Spirit is the antidote to the spirits. And so we have a summary of the first step, that we have a 3-part disease and a 3-part solution. All right? We need to be abstinent. We need to have a transformation, a spiritual awakening, and then we need to live in a way of life. Bill Wilson's very clear that we're recovered but never cured. In the 10th step, he says we have a daily reprieve. Again, the dictionary. the second best book next to as a companion of the big book. Look up the word reprieve. Stay of execution. We have a daily reprieve. We'll talk more about that as we see the context of the 10th step. What does unmanageability mean? It's the key. It has nothing to do with being an alcoholic or practicing your disease of addiction. 1 out of 10 people have the disease of alcoholism. 5 out of 10 people are impacted by that 1 out of 10 people. But that's not 100%. Look at the number there on unmanageability. This is the problem. This is the spiritual malady. This is untreated alcoholism. 10 out of 10. This is the human condition. Read the paper, watch the news. What's going on? All these people, all this chaos, all this controversy, all this betrayal and damage. What is that? Bill simply says it's self-will run riot. All right? And on page 52, he actually tells us what they are, the bedevilments, to be controlled as if by devils. I am having trouble with personal relationships. I am unable to control my emotional nature. I am a prey to misery and depression. I can't make a living, I added, that satisfies me. In my meditation, I was making a living, but I was never satisfied. My satisfaction pit was bottomless. There's not enough recognition, money, power, pleasure is there. This thirst that I misread and translated into material, which can only be satisfied by the spiritual. I have a feeling of uselessness. I am full of fear. I am unhappy. I can't seem to be of real help to other people. And in my meditation, I knew that I didn't really care about helping other people. Yeah, 1988, I studied to be a monk. I studied to be a priest. I studied to be a psychologist. I did all the human development things of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and now I'm in AA as a sponsor. And I knew that I really didn't want to help anybody. I just wanted the reputation of helping people. But actually helping them, you have to get your hands dirty, and it's really inconvenient. I mean, they call at all times, and they whine a lot. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Once again, Einstein has nailed it. People know that I like a whiteboard and that I quote Einstein. So they have a fictitious cartoon of Einstein at a whiteboard, and he's looking at the audience and he's saying, the average alcoholic is very much capable of such feelings as love, affection, intimacy, and caring. These feelings just do not involve anyone else. Oh, there's too much identification there. Exactly, yes, wonderful. And so this process of the 12 steps, if the first step, unmanageability, is the bedevilments, Bill uses that word, page 52, all right? All of that information with mostly is from page 52. And that was the inventory that I took at 10 years of sobriety and saw that it was in technicolor in my life, all right? And which humbled me and prepared me then for the second step. But if in fact the problem is a spiritual malady, the bedevilments, then this process is one of exorcism. What other word could you use? The elimination of the things in us that precipitate actions that we don't want. St. Paul had this query, this complaint in the Christian scripture. I do what I don't want to do, and I do what I don't want to do. Hello? Welcome to my life. Right, exactly. And so it prepares us then to make a decision about power. You might ask yourself, What do you actually believe? It's not a trick question. And I didn't ask you what you think, or know, or want, or have been told, or read. I asked you, what do you actually believe? And then the step guide who took me through the steps at another journey, a week later gave me the second half of that question, after I had written a wonderful theological treatise, because I know some stuff, 10 years of sobriety. Then he gave me the second half of the question. What do you actually believe about God as the first half? How do you behave in light of what you believe was the second half. How do you behave in light of what you believe? And I go, oh. With a process, it wasn't an event, a process. I saw that I was a practical agnostic, but that I had the ability to make a decision about my concept, what I needed God to be. And then I was taken to step 3, and I was invited to follow the process in the book to make a decision. Bill suggests 5 relationships, and the man challenged me. What relationship does your heart yearn for? What relationship? Oh, I love the word, yearn. What relationship does your heart yearn for? With this higher power, with this God, with this source, with this force, whatever the word is for you. And I'm inviting you now to answer those questions. What are the qualities that you need God to have? What is the name or description that you want to give it, capital I-T? And what relationship does your heart yearn for? It's okay to make a new decision today, or to just reinforce the decision that you've made in yesterday. Because I'm going to invite you to pray the 3rd step prayer, a prayer of relationship. You know, there are promises throughout each of the steps. The promises, of course, the 9th step are very well heralded through the program. But the promises of the 3rd step are on page 63. Being all-powerful, God provides what I need. Notice, not what I want. If I keep close to God and perform God's work well. You need to think about, what does that mean? Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves. Hear the dimmer switch. Less and less. Hear the promise. Hear the process. More and more, dimmer switch, process, promise. We became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. Felt new power flow in as we enjoyed peace of mind, as we discovered we could face life successfully, as we became His presence, we began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We were reborn, a very charismatic term that suggests that we're given a new life in making this decision to have this relationship. I'm going to invite you to pray the 3rd step prayer. You won't need to read it. You won't need to know it. I'm going to invite you to pray it antiphonally. This is what we did in the monastery. A bank of monks over here would begin the prayer, and a bank of monks over here would respond back and forth, antiphonally, the sound going back and forth, the words going back and forth, the prayer as a response to one another. I will lead you in the 3rd step prayer. I will pray a word or a phrase, and then you will repeat it. I will pray the next word or phrase, and then you will repeat it. So center yourselves in the presence of the decision that you have just now made or reinforced about God for you and the relationship that your heart yearns for. A decision. It's not about knowing, and it's not about feeling. It's not about certitude. It's not about emotion. It's very dark. It's very thin. It's very insubstantial. It requires faith, a decision without any certitude. Faith, a decision without any feeling. Faith, a decision about reality. Please join me antiphonally. God, I offer myself to you to build with me and to do with me as you wish. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do your will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of your power, your love, and your way of life. May I do your will always. Step 11 suggests that that's the perfect prayer. Thy will be done. I use my free will to align my free will and actions with my understanding of God's will. I was startled a couple years ago to have it brought to my attention. I mean, I'm a big book guy, right? I've read and studied, and I do workshops on the big book and the step process. And a couple years ago, somebody brought to my attention the word surrender is not in the big book. Yeah, it's not there. It's not in the 12 and 12 either. Yeah, I know. Step 3 is not surrender. Step 3 is a very proactive stance. It's a decision to align my will, using my free will, to be in harmony with my understanding of God's will. It's anything but surrender. It's a very proactive, aggressive, confrontational stance, confronting the spiritual malady, confronting the unmanageability, confronting the powerlessness, and taking responsibility for our life, for our freedom, for our spirituality, for our actions. Amazing when you kind of see it in a different light like that. There are obstacles to this power. And Bill suggests that the root, on page 62, the root of the problem is selfishness and self-centeredness. Well, so what's the fruit of the root? Yeah, if I had a tree here and it had oranges on it, no trick questions. If I had a tree here and it had oranges on it, what kind of tree would it be? It would be an orange tree, because you see the fruit. Freud said we have to tap into the unconscious. We can't see our self-centeredness. What we can see is our resentments. We can see our fears. We can see our inappropriate sexual conduct. We can see our dishonesty, our secrets. New words, not in the big book, not even implied, guilt and shame. My words. I want to be very clear about that. We look at the visible to get to the invisible. We look at the behavior to get at the attitude, the thinking, the beliefs. In the fourth step, if you do the third column and the fourth column, I believe as outlined in the big book and as experienced by several people that have led me through the work, you address the behavior for sure, but you look under the behavior to what Bill Wilson suggests on page 64 is the exact nature of the problem, the root, the motives, the beliefs, the values, the core of the problem. The problem is not resentment. That's a manifestation of the problem. In the same way, alcohol, Bill says, is not the problem. Oh, it's a problem if it's the problem. All right, that's what treatment centers are for. That's what AA is for. That's what therapy is for. That's what good church is for. Absolutely. Alcohol is a problem if it's a problem, but once it's not the problem, it's not the problem. dash that our life had become unmanageable is the problem, the spiritual malady. That extreme example of self-will run riot, that self-centeredness which we can't see. I couldn't have seen, in 1988, I thought I was a Renaissance man. Oh yeah, well, I came to understand I was a Neanderthal. Yeah, don't laugh so loud. She's been in my workshop, she knows. That's right, exactly. So we're asleep. Another wonderful philosopher, Gurdjieff, is a Russian philosopher. He says we're asleep dreaming that we're awake. Humans are asleep, dreaming that we're awake. We walk around as zombies, asleep, dreaming that we're awake, thinking that we're awake, and we're not awake at all until we begin to wake up and see that we were asleep. Part of that is seeing the beliefs that we have, which I saw in the third column of the fourth step. Getting underneath of the behavior, looking at my attitude, looking at my perception, looking at my beliefs. Once again, if I had blue glasses on, you would all be blue. Now, I wouldn't know you were blue because it's the only reality I have, looking through blue glasses. Until somebody points out and I take a look at the glasses from a new perspective and see that they're blue. And then I begin to understand that my entire perception creates my attitude. My perception is delusional. My thought is demented. My feeling is diseased. My attitude is distorted. My behavior is dysfunctional. Yes, I like alliteration, all right? Yeah. But the point here is, what we can look at is the bottom level here. We can look at the behavior that's dysfunctional, resentment, fear, inappropriate sex, dishonesty, and secrets. We can look at that, and then we work our way up. We work our way up. We work our way up. We work our way up to the unconscious here, and we see what our beliefs, and I was startled at my beliefs. They were so delusional. I was shown in another environment what a character defect is, an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectation of the individual's culture, is pervasive and inflexible, has an onset in adolescence or early adulthood, is stable over time, and leads to distress or impairment. This is from the DSM-4, all right? It's a psychiatric manual, all right? Yeah, and here's what got my attention when it was given to me, gifted to me by my therapist. Number one, an exaggerated self-importance. Number two, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success and power. 3, belief of being special. 4, requiring excessive admiration. 5, sense of entitlement. 6, selfishness and taking advantage of others to achieve their own ends. 7, lacking empathy. 8, envy of others. 9, behaviors or attitudes that are arrogant, haughty, patronizing, or contemptuous. This is your leader. That's the 9 categories of narcissism. And my therapist said, and it's untreatable by psychological mechanisms. I'm not clinical, so I don't know the truth of that, but I believed him. And now he's not my therapist any longer. He's a co-facilitator in retreats and workshops that we do. And so I asked him last year, I said, so back in the day, 20 years ago, on a scale of 1 to 10, what was I in terms of my narcissism? He says probably a 7. He says 8, 9, and 10 are in prison. All right? And I said, so what would you think I am today? He says, probably a 2. Still there. It never goes away. He says, and therapy did not do that for you. The work that you do in 12 steps, the spiritual program that you're committed to, the spiritual process that you lean into on a daily basis, that's what did it to you. Spiritual awakening. A change in the way we think and feel and behave and it's done to us, not by us. Now, I have worked my little tushy off. Yeah. So I have contributed. And here's the dance. The mystery with a capital M. Grace. And willingness. Somehow there's an alchemic interaction. I don't know how it works. I do know that it works. I don't need to explain it. I took it into meditation to see which comes first, willingness or grace, grace or willingness. I didn't get an answer, but I got some poetry that kind of satisfied me. I was taken to a place of willingness. Hear the grace. I was taken to a place of willingness, but I was willing to be taken. My actions, my responsibility. Didn't answer anything, but it satisfied me. Resentment comes from the Latin word sentire, to feel. When you put an re sentire, it means to feel again and again and again. There's nothing wrong with anger or fear or sex. These are primitive instincts for our survival as an individual and as a race. But of course, the 12 and 12 says that we morph them beyond reason, and it becomes resentment that we hold, and it becomes fear that becomes debilitating, and it becomes inappropriate sex that harms a lot of people and ourselves, and the dishonesty is the flagship, all right? Fight, flight, or hide. It's very biological. We're animals at the basic core of us, and we deal from our survival at the basic core of us, and then we get sophisticated with information and in adulthood and some actions that allow us then to become a responsible human being, aware of our thoughts and attitudes and responsible for our actions. They call that emotional maturity. Bill Wilson on page 64 says, how are we doing? Okay. On page 64, he says that, and is a predecessor to that wisdom saying that I mentioned in earlier, that it doesn't matter what we think and it doesn't matter how we feel, it does matter what we do. He says on page 64, from it, resentment, stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. It works, the dynamic, in all three ways. We need to get abstinent in order to do the steps, in order to have a spiritual awakening, in order to live a spiritual life. But I never stop working the steps with somebody who relapses because they're not guaranteed neutrality to alcohol until they get to the 10th step. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and it's all hand in glove with us. It all works in a rhythm for us, and sometimes it's the spiritual intervention. February 21st, alcohol was removed without my request and without my permission. 1984. I did not intend to quit drinking. I quit drinking to support her recovery. She was in the hospital. I quit drinking to support her recovery, and I haven't had a drink since. It took a couple more months before I went to AA. It took a couple more months before I got a sponsor. It took a couple more months before I worked the steps. Alcohol had been removed. Now that's going to make some of you very agitated because you've worked really hard with your alcohol issue, all right? That's just my experience. So we've talked about our culture, and if you've been in corporate America, of course, corporate America says, you got to know something, you got to feel good about it, then do it, right? That's the way we do it in motivational exercise, right? Well, that's not our spiritual experience. It really is that we need to do it first. Then we'll know, and then we'll feel. All right? And so that's where that sponsorship comes in very, very, very handy. I think there's a lot of moving parts to the 12-step recovery. A lot of moving parts. Meetings, books, steps, prayer, etc. The most important, I believe, ingredient is sponsorship. Because if you do sponsorship, if you have it, if you have a person with whom you're accountable, you will do all the rest. I ask people all the time, do you have a sponsor? And 25% of the people say, no, I don't have a sponsor. And so we have that conversation. But then 75% say, I do have a sponsor. And then I ask the next question, well, when's that last time you talked to your sponsor? Well, let's see, 2008. Well, that's not a sponsor, that's a fantasy, again. Now, there's no recommendation as to who a sponsor is or what a sponsor is or what the frequency is, but it's a regular accountability on a transparent basis. My sponsor required that I call them every day. I don't require that of my men that work with me, but I do suggest they call me once a week and they see me once a month, telling me what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and especially what they're doing. It's the formula from the spiritual awakening. I did not know that. I'm not sure my sponsor knew that when he was asking me to do it. He just knew that it was a mechanism to create outline for the conversation. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And especially, what are you doing? And I ask specific questions about that. I don't ask, are you getting enough sleep? Because the testosterone man will go, yeah, I can live on 4 hours. Oh, really, huh? So then I start asking, well, what time do you go to bed? What time do you get up? And I find out they're really only getting 4 or 5 hours sleep, and it's not enough. 7 to 8, minimum, 7 to 8. Otherwise, you're sleep deprived, and your life will be a series of compensations for sleep deprivation. It's that simple. I use the Maslow chart of hierarchy of values. We start with the biology. We go to the psychology. We go with the sociology. We go with the spiritual and for the full self-actualization. That was an aside. So we talked a lot about beliefs, all right? Now, I've had you name the perpetrator, and that may, in fact, be your resentment. But if you have a resentment currently, name it. That may not be connected with that. But if you have any resentment, a major one, just name it right now. And that's column 1. Did it really happen is, of course, part of the question in the big book, Fancied or Real. Did it really happen the way you remembered it? Was it just not what you wanted, or what you expected, or what you needed, or what you hoped for? When I got real specific questions like that, and I had a resentment about Alan Roman from my 8th grade who broke my nose, and I was asked those questions looking at the circumstances, I saw that we were horsing around on a football field like 12-year-olds do, or 13-year-olds, and that he had me pinned down, both knees on both of my shoulders and arms, and that hurt, and I was uncomfortable, and I was humiliated, and I said something to him that wasn't favorable to his mother and his lineage, or his race, and he brought his hand down on my nose and broke it. The resentment went away right away. He wasn't right in breaking my nose. But my Lord, what I did was call him a racial epithet, etc., and he had a reaction to it. I initiated his action. It doesn't exonerate his action, but now I can take full responsibility, and the resentment went, poof, disappeared. Then I have to understand it. The resentment. Column 2, how did it develop? Something happened that I didn't want, or something did not happen that I wanted. What did I hope for? Key question under resentment. Key question under forgiveness. Key question under wound. What did I hope for? What did I hope for? Was it realistic? I hoped for a car when I was 16. I was very immature. My father didn't give me the promised car. I had a resentment until I did this work and saw that if he had given me a car, I would have killed somebody or myself. There was no question. I was totally immature at 16. Was it in my best interest only? I was working and thinking that I should have this promotion. And it had nothing to do with my competency, my contribution to the firm, my contribution to the stockholders, my contribution to the employees. It had everything to do with me and my power, money, and prestige. The resentment went away. It was all about me. It wasn't about them and the unfairness of it all. Was it good for all involved is the question. And so then we come to the third column, which there's so very little in the big book. There's lists, but it doesn't explain what to do with it or what they even mean, those words. So I do an extended third column, which I'm not going to go through here, but it's really about my story. It's about my delusion. Who am I? Put yourself on a stage with the person with whom you have the resentment or the unforgiveness. In your imagination, this is your work, put yourself on a stage and you're facing this person with a resentment. Who are you? Those 9 ingredients came to mind. I am a superior person, entitled and special. I'm exempt from the rules of the little people. All right? I was startled. With all the therapy I had had, with all the education I'd had, I'd never seen that, except when I was plumbing the depths of this third column, given it an expanded interpretation. What was my belief that I was looking through? Well, if I believe I'm superior, how am I going to treat you? Like you're inferior, and that you should recognize the superiority of me, and in my presence you should back up and bow. Yes, precious. Oh, just precious. Yes. Okay. So who are others? Who are they? We have a belief about the world. Who I am, who they are, and how the world works. And the key to that is should. It's a simple key. Challenge yourself when you say, my sister should help me. Really? Who made that rule? Parents should love their children. Really? Who made that rule? Challenge it. All right? You don't get to make up reality. Oh, I did. I made up reality. I made up who I was, I made up who you were, and I made up how the life worked. And for 48 years to 51, I lived that way, doing this work. And I just gave you a time frame. It was over a 3 to 10 year period of this unfolding, all right? Of this unfolding, this process. I heard a great line, you don't make a tulip grow by pulling on it. Come on, be with me. You don't make a tulip grow by pulling on it. No, you got to let it be in the sunshine and the water and the nutrients from the earth, and it grows at its own pace. You don't make a human develop by beating on them, by cajoling them, by frothy emotional appeal, he says in the big book. It's a process that we need to submit to. And it's agonizingly slow sometimes. And yet, once you've submitted to it and you look back over your shoulder periodically, you go, wow, look at that. I'm changed in the way I think and feel and behave. I didn't know it was happening, but it was happening all along. Column 4 is about reality. And we have to say, what is my perceived role? All right. On this stage, my perceived role is overlooked employee because I was expecting this promotion and they gave it to somebody else. That was my perceived role. Well, it was delusional, as I've begun to indicate to you that I was able to see. And so the third column is about the lie, the delusion, and the fourth column is about the truth. What is the actual history versus my feelings today? This is fundamental to resentment and letting it go. This is also fundamental to forgiveness and letting it go. That decision to release, because what you're holding on to is yesterday. Yesterday's over. The person may have been criminal. They may have been demented or delusional or spiritually or emotionally bankrupt. Absolutely. And they may have done things that were absolutely tragic and determined the course of your life. Absolutely. But here you are. And that event and that person is no longer influencing you except as you recreate the feelings in yourself. You traumatize yourself. You are the victim of your own perpetration. And to the extent that you hold these feelings about the history, you're in the bondage of your history. And it's about making a decision to release those feelings. Now, that's not easy, but it is a decision, like the third step. It's a decision, but it'll have no impact unless you do 4 through 9. The decision to release it will have no impact unless you do the process of the forgiveness process, the steps 4 through 9, and maybe even need additional help through professional intervention, therapy. All right? There are specialists who work with trauma. There are institutions that take people in that work with trauma for a week, special intensive submersion, or a month, or longer, because of the level of problems that people have. Ask yourself, I feel wounded, I feel betrayed, I feel anger at that, they, it. Whose feeling is it? No, really? Whose feeling is it? Oh, crap. It's my feeling. It's my feeling. I'm continuing to perpetuate the event or the trauma because I'm holding the feeling. You have to ask yourself the benefit. What's the benefit? And the first answer I get from everybody, oh, there's no benefit. Well, why are you holding it? Oh, yeah, there's a benefit. I don't know what it is. We're penetrating the unconscious. Maybe it's because I can maintain a victim stance. In maintaining a victim stance, I can stay irresponsible. In maintaining an irresponsible stance, I don't have to be accountable to anybody because don't you know? I'm not making fun of it. This is serious stuff, and people suffer seriously from it. Absolutely. If you make a decision not to suffer, if you make a decision to take some action, you will be free from it over time. And that's just evidence in the research, and that's evidence from my experience. What am I doing, especially? If you can't get a grasp on what you're thinking, take a look at what you're doing in relationship to how you're feeling, and then work your way back. What is the fear of not getting what I want or losing what I have? The dishonesty? These are questions from the fourth column. Misrepresenting myself to myself? Not taking responsibility at the very least? I am responsible. That's the heavy question at the end of the fourth column inventory. Where am I responsible? That's my word. It's not from the big book. They say at fault, to blame, wrong. Those are the words from the big book. I like the word responsible. Where am I responsible for my perceptions, for my attitude, for my reaction? Fred Luskin says, we are not to take the stuff outside of us personally. We are to take the stuff inside of us personally. What a great distinction. I don't take the stuff outside of me, events, circumstances, people, personally. Well, we do because we're the center of the universe. Look it up in the dictionary, solipsism. Yeah, I am the sun, and the world is the planets that rock around me, right? Wrong. My reaction to the problem is the problem. See, the problem is people and events and circumstances, of course. But then it's my reaction to them that is my problem. And the difference between a reaction and a response is the pause. To pause. That's what the 10-step is all about. On the back of the handout, there's a prayer for the removal of deep resentments. And you can morph it in any way that you want. It's not an official prayer. It's a prayer that's scripted from the words and phrases and ideas and concepts in the big book, pages 66 and 67. And when the man asked me to make a list of my deep resentments, I had 8, and he said, now pray a prayer for the removal of those resentments. Notice, in the rooms you hear all the time, pray for them. Great. It's a wonderful spiritual practice. I endorse it. But that's not the instructions on page 67. The prayer practice that's recommended to remove deep resentment is a prayer to the Spirit to enter into my heart and soul to excise, surgically remove my resentment. It's a prayer for me because I'm powerless. Oh, I can name it. I can analyze it. I can confess it, but I can't remove it. I ask the universe, the Spirit, God, higher power, my higher self, whatever it is your concept in steps 2 and 3, to enter as the divine surgeon to remove this cancer of resentment or unforgiveness. It took 3 months, praying 8 prayers each day for me to realize intuitively that one of them had been removed. And then over the next several weeks, praying 7, praying 6, praying 5, they were all removed. And here's the really good news. None of them ever returned. None of them ever returned. If you want freedom, this is a process that is suggested to give you some freedom from your resentment, to give you some freedom from your sense of unforgiveness. I am not perfect or special. I have made mistakes which hurt others, which hurt myself. I made unhealthy decisions. I have taken inappropriate actions. I have taken actions that I have not taken actions that I should have. I am a human learning from my mistakes, but at the same time, they're human learning from their mistakes. We are the same. This is the humility that step 7 talks about. It's not humiliation. It's perspective. It's the truth. It's about accepting reality as it is, not how I manufacture it. And the reality is, humus is the Latin derivative. Earth, dirt. I'm as common as dirt, one of many. I'm not any better, I'm not any worse. We're all the same. I operate from my self-interest. They operate from their self-interest. I do not act with them in mind. Oh, they do not act with me in mind. Fabulous concepts to say, oh, yes, this is the reality. Reality is what it is. If you're familiar with Byron Katie, she says reality what reality is, but only 100% of the time. That's perfect. Yeah. We can't negotiate reality. We can't negotiate biological principles. We can't negotiate physical principles. We can't negotiate the principles of psychology. We can't negotiate spiritual principles. They are what they are, and when we transgress these principles, they will crush us. Crush us. Read a book on flying. Prepare to fly. Make some really good wings and really want to fly, and go to a 30-story building and jump off with your wings. You will die. Because the law of gravity doesn't care what you want, feel, or how you're prepared. Spiritual principles are exactly the same. And that's why we do steps 11 and 12. To learn about spiritual principles and to align ourselves with our understanding of spiritual principles. Acceptance is the key here. Acceptance of reality. Of course, in the balance of the steps, we do the 5th step confession, we do the 6th step list of shortcomings and character defects, and we pray for their removal. Again, exorcism. One more time, realizing that we're powerless over our character defects, and humbly, it says, humbly in step 7, asking for their removal, because we can't do that. Join me, please, in the 7-step prayer with the key character defect that you're very aware of, that's kicking your butt and reducing the quality of your life today. With that specific character defect in mind, in unison, join me in what I call the healing prayer, which is the 7-step prayer. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. It's a wonderful prayer to use at the conclusion of your morning meditation practice, if you have one, and that is because of that last line. Grant me strength as I go out from here, from my meditation practice in the morning, to do your bidding. And then, of course, and I'm putting forgiveness in the context of the 12-step process, because that's absolutely my experience. So I've woven into it the process that was recommended by Fred Luskin and other psychologists and other ministers. There's wonderful books by organized religion and by psychology, but my familiarity and my experience is 12 steps. So I take the benefit of their information and experience and weave it into my 12-step experience. We have to name the harms that we have done, all right? Not the harms that they have done to us. There's a process in psychology called rebuke, where in fact you address and confront the perpetrator, but that's not what we're talking about. This is not a psychological process. This is a spiritual process, where you own not the event. This is so crucial that you get this. People can't see beyond their feelings when we're talking about steps 8 and 9 or about forgiveness. They can't see beyond their feelings. They're mired in it like a quicksand swamp. But extricate yourself. Just step back just a little bit and say, whose feelings are they? Yes, it was done to me. And it was tragic and sometimes criminal. Yes, 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 yes. But you're not responsible for the event, and you're not responsible for the circumstances. You are 100% responsible today for your feelings about those events, those persons, and those circumstances. 100% responsible. There is nobody else that's responsible for your feelings. Welcome to adulthood. No, it's so hard. Oh, really? Come on. A little bit of blame goes a long ways. Yeah, right. And so here's where we make the decision to release them. We take responsibility for the harms that we have caused, and knowing that they've just done what they've done without us in mind typically, even when it was done to us. And even though it was done to us over many times or many years, it wasn't because they were doing it to us, they were just doing it. Review the negative consequences of holding the unforgiveness. I've done some reading. I'm not a researcher. I'm not credentialed professional. But all of the reading and the research is conclusive. Holding resentments and unforgiveness, a stance of unforgiveness in your biology creates strokes, cancer, and heart attacks. In your emotional life, creates anger, fear, stress. In your psychological life, puts you in a victim stance and promulgates the defense mechanisms of projection, all right? And creates social problems of isolation and loneliness and spiritual problems of an obstacle to the relationship with the sunlight of the Spirit. I think of the shadow. These obstacles are the shadow in us. Freud talked about the false self. Carl Jung talked about the shadow self. And this whole process is the deconstruction of the false front, the persona that we have, that we've created, not consciously, but as a survival mechanism. This was the way we survived, to create in the public image and even to ourselves this mask which protected us. And it was good to a point, and then it lost its point. Like step 4 in the 12 on 12 talks about. They've morphed into a distortion of the reality of the survival mechanisms. In fact, they control us. And as long as they control us by our feelings about it, nothing can change. My quality of life deteriorates. I need to make a decision to end my suffering and to bring joy into my life. I saw a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker several years ago. There's a man in a complete space, a desert space like this, and he's all really haggard, all right? But there's nothing around him, and he's holding 2 bars up like this, and he's looking through them. There's nothing, the bars are not attached to anything except his hands. That's our resentment. That's our unforgiveness. We're in the bondage of a jail that we created. Make a decision to drop the bars. Make a decision to release them. Make a decision to take responsibility for your feelings about it. I read this in a book that's kind of a self-help book just recently. A forgiving person has no past. An unforgiving person has no future. You could, it's not black and white, but that really captures it. A forgiving person has no past. An unforgiving person has no future. So, Fred Luskin says, how about giving them an incentive? If you have something that you just can't forgive, I'm going to offer you $20 million if you will, in fact, legitimately forgive it. Would you do that? Well, hello? How about this? I hold a gun to your head, and it's got 6 bullets in it, and I'm going to pull the trigger unless I, on my little screen, know that you have, in fact, released and forgiven this person. Would you forgive them? Well, yeah. You have the incentive, either the positive or the negative. That's all it takes, is what is the incentive? What is the value? Would you rather be happy or right? Do you want to live a life of bondage or a life of freedom? Choose. It's a process. And then you need to make the decision to release them and make a decision to be released. The balance, of course, is the way of life that we live, and Bill Wilson suggests in the big book that it commences here. It commences this way of living as we cleaned up the past. We record over the past. Or another mental image is that we have the channel changer in our hand for our life. And we can see in our mind's eye and our memory anything, any channel that we want. Change the channel. Yeah, make a decision to change the channel. These are the kind of tips that kind of like put the responsibility right on me. I have the channel changer right here. Our way of living, all right, is to continue with inventory, of course, to eliminate the sludge from the channel, and then to fill the channel with grace, with love, with God in prayer and meditation, and then to empty that channel in service to others. There's a great parallel in history. There are two seas, two bodies of water in Palestine, Galilee. One is the Sea of Galilee and the other is the Dead Sea. Both have tributaries giving water to the lakes. But only one has a flow away from the lake. The Dead Sea is dead because it has no exit. It's a stagnant pool. The Sea of Galilee is vibrant with life because it has an exit into the farmlands. It's amazing. 11 and 12, what I call the spiritual coin. One side, our relationship with other. The other side, our relationship with other. Other with a capital O, other with a small o. Our relationship with God through prayer and meditation. Our relationship with the community of humanity, not just 12-step, through service, wanting to help. So once again, staying with the model of the human being, we transition into the 10th step. Bill suggests that we have recovered. That is the first half of the first step, body and mind. And that's physical sobriety. But that we're not cured. We're never cured. We have a daily reprieve. There's the difference. Sure, I'm recovered because I am not drinking nor thinking about drinking. But I'm not cured because I'm always thinking about me. Right? And I'm powerless again. That's that unmanageability. But manifested in the bedevilments that I listed before and that you can find on page 52 in the big book. Once again, the problem is that we're asleep. We don't see our beliefs. Those are the lenses through which we look, and they're distorted. And then they create emotions that are disturbed. And the 12 and 12 suggests a spiritual axiom. And when I first saw it, I hated it. It's a spiritual axiom, 12 and 12, on step 10. When we're disturbed, there is something wrong with us. Give me a break. When we're disturbed, there is something wrong with us. It's perfect, of course. Who's disturbed? I'm disturbed. So we need to stay awake. We do the inventory, we do the meditation, and we stay accountable. Steps 10, 11, and 12. Step 10 says we watch for the 4 things that we looked at in step 4 inventory. Step 10 is a recap of steps 4 through 9. We look at the 4 things that were the obstacles to the power. When we're disturbed, we pause and look at these things, and then we take some action. It's pray because we're powerless. It's talk to somebody because we're human, 5th step type thing. We make an amend because we're typically creating carnage. And that's the 8 and 9, of course. And then we're of service. We turn our thoughts to helping somebody else. Now, it is this simple. The spiritual process and the spiritual journey is just this simple. Take a look up here once again. If, in fact, I am self-centered, the root of my problem is self-centeredness, then the turning that is suggested in the big book bill on page 14, simple but not easy. A price has to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light, who presides over us all. And on the beginning of step 3 at the page 59, where it starts articulating the steps, all right, he says, we are at the turning point. We're not at the surrender point. We're at the turning point, which is to make a decision to turn in prayer and in service. Steps 11 and 12. If I am self-centered, then the antidote is other-centeredness. Carl Jung said, spiritus contra spiritum. The spirit is the antidote to spirits. My thirst is unquenchable, and I try to fill it with drugs and alcohol and food and addictions of all time, both substance and process. And when I submit to a process, I am turned, but I am willing to turn, and more especially, I am willing to be turned. To have a relationship. I cannot change the past events or feelings. I can just change the present feelings about the past events and feelings. This is at the heart of the grievance story. Unenforceable rules. That's that should that I talked about earlier. Ask yourself, when you're disturbed, what unenforceable rule am I trying to enforce? They should recognize me. They should be kind. They should drive carefully on the freeway. They should not cut me off. Really? They're just doing their thing. It's not you they're cutting off, honey. Right? It's hard. This reality stuff sucks. Make yourself, now here, this is going to sound contrary to everything that you've heard in the spiritual journey. But Fred Luskin made the point, and I'm making it here. He said, if you have unforgiveness, you've made the event or the person the center of your story. You need to make yourself the center of your story. That's different than self-centeredness. Your life is your life, and this is your story. Become the main protagonist in your story, not giving the power away to somebody else. Make a decision to have a better present. We will never have a better childhood. My wife is Irish, and she used a word in another context about marinating in self-pity. That's what the Irish do, right? They marinate in self-pity and resentment too. But how about marinating in the positive? Marinating in the positive. The research is in that when in fact you practice forgiveness, you bring joy into your life, and trust, and honesty, and love. And then we call that emotional sobriety. I'm asked all the time, what is God's will, what is my will? And it's a really heart-opening question, soul-rending question. What is God's will, what is my will? And it's the whole purpose of the step process, to become acquainted with what is God's will and what is my will. If in fact you're experiencing this, you're in your will. If you're experiencing this, you're in God's will. By your fruits, you will know them. It's that simple. I don't trust this as much as I used to. I still begin to trust it now because of the transformation I've had. But it's still potentially delusional. My feet are never delusional. How I behave tells me the truth. How I behave will tell you the truth. Take a look at how you behave. That's what you believe. That is your truth. That is who you are. How I behave is who I am. But, no. It's the truth 100% of the time. And so I mentioned that steps 11 and 12 are in fact the turning to improve and enlarge our spiritual life, the relationship with other with a capital O, one side of the coin, a relationship with the community of humanity, the other side of the coin. I don't use the term service any longer. I use the term help. And once you have that filter, that belief, that lens to look through the big book as you're reading it, so many times he uses the term help as that outward stance of being present to the world around us. Whether it's in your relationship, chapter 8, whether it's in your family, chapter 9, whether it's in your work relationship, chapter 10, and whether it's in your community or your fellowship, chapter 11. If you haven't read Chuck C's book, A New Pair of Glasses, it's just wonderful because it talks about practicing principles in all those affairs, and he comes up with one simple mantra. How can I help you do what you need to get done? How can I help you get done what you need to get done? That's the attitude of service. Prayer meditation is very easy. Quite frankly, you would think after 7 years I would know how to do that in the monastery. I didn't. I learned how to meditate from those two pages, pages 85 to 88 in the big book. On your seat was a handout that is my meditation practice, and it's simply the outline of the material from the big book and the 12 and 12. He tells us what to do in the evening is an inventory. He tells us what to do in the morning, which is asking for guidance coming from his Oxford group experience. He wanted to know what God's will was for the day, and then he needed the power to do it, knowledge of your will, power to carry it out. It's really that simple. And then it's also more complicated. I have a 7-hour CD on prayer meditation. I mean, yeah, of course, because there's a lot of implications to it and a lot of techniques which come from all of the world's diverse efforts at a relationship with the mystery. So change is the promise of the spiritual awakening, a way you think and feel and behave, and it's done to us, not by us. That's the key to the 12th step. Page 89 says, immunity. I love it. If we have a spiritual disease, the antidote, the immunization, is carrying the message, helping, being of service. I've talked about the relationships and the principles. Awakening is to turn from the self-centeredness to the other-centeredness. Gandhi said, be the change that you want to effect. St. Francis is alleged to have said, wherever you go, preach the good news. That's the gospel. Good news is a translation for gospel. And he's talking about Christian evangelization, but let's extrapolate it to this circumstance, in this context. Wherever you go, preach the good news if you have to use words. Cool. Be the big book. Be the spiritual conversion. Be the practice of principles. Be the model for people. And they go, I like the way that person lives, not just talks, but I like the way that person lives. They have a quality that I want. Be the lantern. Be a channel of life. Oh, there's a life cycle thing that Bill talks about in the article that he published in 1958 called Emotional Sobriety. A page and a half, and it's a wonderful article, but it's the basis of a new workshop that I'm doing in co-facilitating with Dr. Alan Berger on emotional sobriety and spiritual sobriety. And Bill talks about the healing cycle in there. And it just captured me, and I've thought about it a lot. That healing cycle, this is it. This enables me to realize that I am loved and that I am a loving person. This is the healing cycle. When I act like a loving person, notice, not know that I'm a loving person, not feel that I'm a loving person. When I act like a loving person, and we have it in our wisdom sayings, all right? Act as if. It's actually good psychology. Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA, who's done a lot of work in brain research, he has come up with this wonderful discovery about the brain plasticity, he calls it, right? 10 years ago, we didn't think that you could, in fact, change the brain. Now, because of his work and others like him, we know that the brain does change. And how does it change? When we do differently. When we take actions that are different than our prior actions, we actually change our brain chemistry. We create new brain synapses, new brain neural pathways that establish new habits, new feelings, new perceptions, and new behaviors. So now he has demonstrated what we've known all along. It doesn't matter what you know, and it doesn't matter how you feel. It does matter what you do, and when you do differently, you will think differently, and you will feel differently. When I act like a loving person, then I am open to the experience of being loved. Then I become a loved person. This enables me to realize that I am loved and that I am a loving person. Did you hear the cycle of that? And it's a perpetual motion machine. It continues to grow. I remember when I came into the program realizing that I drank because of my low self-esteem. Now, my mechanism was to overcompensate with grandiosity. Others don't do that, but that was my mechanism for compensation. But it was a compensation for this low self-esteem, this lack of sense of worthiness, and I can explain it psychologically in terms of my relationship with my father, and I've done some work in that area, terrific, and I needed to do the work in that area, but I needed to do this spiritual work. And the most spiritual work that I've been able to do is when I'm helping other people, and sometimes I'm helping other people in the beginning when I didn't want to. Now it's become an organic growth in me that 24/7, it's all I want to do. I have to be careful that it doesn't become an obsession. Maybe it already is. Mary would know. But it grows organically, all right? And what happened is now I feel so innately to my core worthwhile. Not in a pride sense, but just in a love sense, in a sense of I'm a good person. And it didn't come about because I was told it or read it or thought it or wanted it. It became up because I did it. I acted lovingly and I became loved by me and by others. It's an amazing healing cycle. And in short, my life is a love story. I now manifest my true nature, my true self. Another, Greg Boyle, Homeboy Industries, a Jesuit priest, fabulous book called Tattoos on the Heart. And he says, God loved us into life because God thought we'd enjoy it. Wow, that's so cool. God loved us into life because God thought we would enjoy it. I am the love of God. See, it's about that orientation on my nature. I am not a victim, all right? I get to choose to turn from the disease to harmony in all of these various ways. This is the turning point, as I mentioned, unhealthy self-esteem to healthy self-worth. I have been transformed from a preoccupation with my will to a preoccupation with finding out and doing what is God's will. And so to bring it to a conclusion, it's about a change. This forgiveness process is about a change, but it starts with a decision and an acknowledgement of reality and that I'm powerless to make the decision, and I'm powerless to acknowledge reality. I'm screwed. That's why we have so many prayers that we've talked about today. This prayer process, this process of spirituality, this 12-step process is an admission of desperation. I am hopeless and helpless, and I am still 100% responsible. And so it's about my attitude. I am the center of my story. I give life. I give life its meaning. I do. It doesn't have an innate meaning. I give it the meaning that it has for me. Reality is objective. Reality is objective. Reality is not created by me. It is what it is, and I need to just accept it. Now, I have to learn how to set boundaries. I don't have to accept your interpretation of reality, all right, if it impinges on my interpretation of reality. But I have to be in acceptance, which is a practice. Gratitude opens the heart. I regularly recommend to the men I work with that they, in their morning, whether they have a prayer practice or not, in their morning, they write out one thing they're grateful for, just one, and that they don't repeat it. That each morning they have to be creatively come to a new thing that day they're grateful for. It opens the heart. It gives you a perspective. It creates compassion. I am not a victim. I accept reality as it is. I detach from my demands. Reality doesn't respond to my demands. There's a story in the big book that was written by Dr. Paul. It was called the Dr. Alcoholic Addict at one time on 449. They changed the title and they changed the location. I think it's on 413, but I'm not sure. But it's about acceptance. If you haven't read it or read it recently, read that. It's about acceptance. It's the key. I accept accountability for my behavior. I hold myself accountable to my therapist. I hold myself accountable to my sponsor. I hold myself accountable to my spiritual director. Those are three different men. I hold myself accountable to my family, to my wife and my kids. All right? Transparently with my wife, not so with my kids. And the third is to practice the actions. I co-create my life. Do you love the word? You've heard it before. But in the context we've been talking about, mystery and grace, willingness and grace, I co-create my life. Grace is the source. And I live in that milieu, that source. And it sustains me. And my goal is to have a relationship through communion of full union with that mystery. But it's up to me to respond. God is never absent. The mystery is never not present. It's always present. The mystery always leans up against me gently, but is very respectful and will only come in when invited. Usually. I don't want to make black and white statements because I know about miracles. Decisions come from my attitude. My attitude is one of acceptance, and my actions flow from my attitude. Make a decision to release your resentments. Make a decision to release those that are unforgiven in you, your feelings about it. Pray about it, perhaps on your knees. We get on our knees not to get God's attention. We get on our knees to get our attention. It's an act of subordination, an act of submission, an act of humility. And then hold yourself accountable to somebody for the process, for guidance in the process. And walk it one day at a time. And you will experience this change, as you have. I know I'm preaching some of this to the choir. We can be happy, joyous, and free. We can find our true self. We can find our true destiny. Please join me in the closing prayer. And it's the prayer of St. Francis, which I call the prayer of transformation. Listen to it as a process. Listen to it as the turning. Listen to it as the promise and the invitation. Please join me in unison. Lord, make me a channel of your peace, that where there is hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring the spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, that where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there is I may bring light, that where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than to be comforted, to understand than to be understood, to love than to be loved. For it is by self-forgetting that one finds, it is by forgiving that one is forgiven, it is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen. Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, and I've learned to read with a highlighter, I came to a passage and it said, the secret to life. Oh my God, I stopped. I got a new highlighter. Yeah, that's going to need a new, fresh highlighter, all right? So, so I underlined it. The secret to life is to die. Before you die, and know and realize there is no death. This process of 12-step turning and this process of forgiveness is about dying to your self-centeredness and awakening to your true self. Thank you.